The leaders of Iran, Turkey and Russia gather for a summit on Syria, Ukraine and other global issues. Hello, I'm Anton and this is The Heat. The conflicts in Syria and Ukraine were on the agenda as Vladimir Putin, Ebrahim Raisi and Recep Tayyip Erdogan met in Tehran. The leaders were also involved in bilateral discussions about trade and security. We begin with this report from CGTN's Ehsan Keivani.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan were in Tehran on Tuesday to attend a trilateral summit aimed in large part at helping restore peace and stability to Syria. The three countries are considered guarantor states of peace in Syria, known as the Astana format. Throughout the day, multiple bilateral meetings were held. Both Putin and Erdogan met with the supreme leader of Iran. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei told the Turkish president that the issue of the Syrian territorial integrity is very important, saying any military action in northern Syria would definitely harm both Turkey and Syria and would instead benefit terrorists. The leader also called for increased trade volume between the two neighboring countries. To that end, President Ebrahim Raisi and Erdogan announced during a press conference a pledge to increase their bilateral trade to a record high of $30 billion. Separately, on the issue of Ukraine, according to the Kremlin, President Putin was expected to brief his Iranian and Turkish counterparts on Russia's military operation there and discuss related issues with them. Ahead of the summit, Tehran and Moscow signed a memorandum of understanding outlining a deal for Russia's giant energy firm Gazprom to inject up to $40 billion worth of investment into Iran's oil and natural gas industry. At the end of the summit, the three presidents released a joint statement. Ehsan Keivani, CGTN, Tehran.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Fairfax, Virginia, Mustafa Gurbuz is a senior adjunct professor at American University. Here in Washington, D.C. is Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor of history at American University. Out of Beijing, Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute. And from Tehran, we're joined by Akbar Dareini. He is a researcher and writer at the Center for Strategic Studies in Tehran. Welcome to all of you. Akbar Dareini, let me start with you. This is the seventh meeting of this particular group. It's a trilateral meeting, and as our reporter just pointed out, it's taking place under the auspices of what is known as the Astana process or Astana format, which is meant to ensure the stability of Syria, peace in Syria as well. On that particular issue, what kind of progress do you expect from this meeting?
Iran and Russia enjoy identical views on Syria. They do have differences with Turkey, but this is an opportunity for all of them to come to an agreement to promote peace in Syria. But although the talks are being conducted under the Astana format, but the stakes are high. It's way beyond the Syrian issue. The Trilateral Iran Summit seeks to demonstrate that the United States is not the world hegemon anymore, that the unipolar system is over, and that the world is moving towards a multipolar system. Putin's and Erdogan's visit to Iran means that a new world order is in the making. The Ukraine war, the gradual withdrawal of US military forces from West Asia, rising tensions with China, and Washington's failure to lift the sanctions against Iran have all transformed international politics. So it is fair to say that the visit is loaded with strategic significance. Russia and Iran seek to demonstrate to the world that they are not isolated, The Ukraine war, as well as severe Western sanctions that have targeted Iranian and Russian economies, have provided new opportunities for both of them to work together to forge closer ties for the benefit of their own strategic interests. Both are the target of an all-out economic war, and this makes them natural allies, important partners. So they have obvious reasons to become close friends, mainly due to the geopolitics of the region and the world. In short, the visit to Tehran by Putin and Erdogan should be interpreted within the context of the ever-increasing divide between the East and the West, and following the Ukraine war and the current period of transition to a multipolar system.
Mustafa Gurbuz, of course, Turkey and Russia are on opposite sides of the conflict in Syria, and as Akbar Dareini just told us a moment ago, the stakes are very high for the region as well. I mean, the fact that these two major powers, Russia and Turkey, are on opposite sides of the conflict, does it make it far more difficult to reach agreement on how this conflict is resolved, or do you think they could find some common ground?
Well, it's a very, very good question. I'd like to take it from the perspective of the Ukraine war and the shifts in Turkish foreign policy in the past year. So on the one hand, we see this Turkey's change of heart to a certain extent with the recalibration of the relationship with the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Israel, and clearly sending a message to Biden administration about its new direction. On the other hand, this balancing act would require to understand the importance of Russian leverage points in Syria. So what does that mean? Simply two things. In the northwestern Syria, Idlib region, Russia has a very powerful leverage point about the humanitarian issue. Recently, Russia did put a veto at the United Nations, and UN accepted Kremlin's position to extend 6 more months. But there is this looming humanitarian crisis, which would make 4 million refugees at the gates of Turkey in Idlib, and that has been a very major issue 2 years ago when Russia had an attack in Idlib, putting some Turkish soldiers under attack. And we know Erdogan immediately called European Union and requested their help in opening the gates to Europe. So the refugee issue on northwestern Syria is very much tied to northern Syrian operation, because again, Erdogan would like to make some refugees to go back to Syria. So these are two things in tandem.
Okay, Mustafa, one of the concerns that's been expressed by President Erdogan is the threat of terrorism from Syria. Let's listen to what the president said about that.
I hear statements from you, our dear friends, that you understand Turkey's security concerns. I'm grateful for that. However, words alone do not heal the wounds. The complete withdrawal of PKK, PYD and YPG units at least 30 kilometers away from our border is a requirement of the agreements made in the past. However, this has still not been achieved.
So Mustafa, talk to us about these threats that Turkey see coming from Syria and how they factor into any kind of agreement that might be reached down the road.
Yeah, so two threats. One is Kurdish statehood, which is, of course, Turkey is saying U.S. is supporting Kurdish statehood in northern Syria. So apparently Turkey is on the side with Russia and Iran on that matter. And seeing this leverage point, perhaps if Russia would give a green light for an operation, which would make Erdogan domestically, before the elections, could sell it that Turkey's Syrian refugees could go back, as well as Kurdish statehood cannot be accepted On the other hand, the other threat is very much what I just described in Idlib, because 4 million within Turkey, 4 million at the gates of Turkey in Idlib region. And in Idlib region, Russia is not on the side of Turkey.
Yeah.
And these are two things as the leverage points. What we could expect, simply, Russia could give a green light to Turkey to a limited extent.
Yeah.
So that Turkey would be in the loop, having this Astana process ongoing, in which this this sense of what my colleague described, the U.S. Middle East policy and Turkey is not necessarily all aligned in one place, but rather resistance to superpower with Russia, Iran, and that these negotiations could be an ongoing process.
Okay.
In the case in the past few years.
Anton, Fedyashin, President Putin said that the three sides had adopted, quote, concrete measures to promote intra-Syrian dialogue, which will ensure the country's territorial integrity, which ensure the country's sovereignty. Essentially, is President Putin saying here, look, we can talk as much as we want to, we can come up with resolutions, we can come up with ideas with the best of intentions, but ultimately it's up to the Syrians to resolve this themselves?
That's exactly what he's saying, Anand, and that's been the Russian position throughout the Syrian conflict, although the Russians made a very firm commitment to keeping Assad in power in order to prevent a complete collapse of the Syrian state and the turning of the country into a free-for-all. And the breeding ground for terrorism. I think the bigger takeaway from what happened today in Tehran for me, and I always see things from the historical perspective, is that the three sides are deciding to settle the many disagreements they have amongst themselves on Syria and many other issues in the Middle East, but they are settling these questions between themselves with mutual respect and a political will towards dialogue. Almost exactly 80 years ago in Tehran, during the Second World War, the first of three major great power conferences took place. Back then, it was Joseph Stalin representing the Soviet Union, Churchill, Great Britain, and FDR, the United States. And back then, Tehran was a turning point because it was the beginning of the de-Europeanization of global politics. Two new actors were emerging, the two new superpowers. Tehran 22 is certainly not as monumental a turning point, but part of a very important trend, and that trend is towards de-westernization and de-Americanization of Middle Eastern politics with much broader Eurasian and global ramifications. And by this, I do not mean that the Europeans and the United States are no longer going to play a role in the Middle East or in Eurasia. Of course they will. But there will not be a clear dominance, especially from the United States. And it's interesting because when you compare the rhetoric out of the joint statement of the three coming out of Tehran today to the way that Biden spoke about the United States coming back to the Middle East because it cannot handle a vacuum of power. When you're invited to someone's house and you call their house in a vacuum, you're essentially communicating to the people who are receiving you that they have no will, and without American, superiority and guidance, they cannot organize their affairs on their own. Well, it looks like in Tehran, the three sides that we saw today are at least moving in the direction of settling conflicts without direct American participation.
Einar, Tangen, do you agree that the broader message that this conference sends is that, as Ali Akbar Dareini told us a moment ago, that the United States is no longer the world hegemon and that the unipolar moment is over?
Well, I would agree. I mean, multipolarism is here. It's de facto. I mean, Biden going to MBS, doing the fist bump, but getting nothing in return is a real signal. I mean, U.S. power is not the way it was. But you know, this is not something that's very simple. Just having these conferences between powers that wish to settle regional disputes by themselves does not mean that the U.S. is going away. Support for the Kurds will continue, especially as it becomes more hardened, in the sense that they have at least two hardened adversaries, Iran and Russia, on one side, and they're trying to convince Erdogan that he should be on the U.S. side. So this kind of political football, this proxy wars, fortunately, with bloodshed, will continue.
One other point worth mentioning, Einar, in the context of this changing world that we're seeing right now, Iran, of course, is a country that the United States and its European allies are trying very hard to isolate, but Iran will now be joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's one of the world's biggest political, economic, and security alliances. How significant is that?
It's very significant what it's doing with European nations like Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and now you have other groups who are joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is not a military alliance. It's simply to deal with regional issues, especially terrorism. But it does, bring back the specter of World War I that Henry Kissinger just recently referred to in giving Biden advice not to see this world in this kind of simplistic old world format, and to understand that there's permanence to these countries and they have to be dealt with.
Ali Akbar Dareini, just ahead of this trilateral meeting, Iran warned Turkey not to engage in any new military operations in Syria. In fact, the Iranian leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, said any new military action will be to the detriment of Turkey, Syria, and the region. How deep are these differences between the two countries?
Iran is urging Turkey to resolve the issue through dialogue. From Iran's perspective, Turkish attacks or military operations in northern Syria will be detrimental to peace. Iran does support the Assad government. It shares identical view with Russia, but Iran cannot agree to Turkish a military invasion of an independent state like Syria. But at the same time, Iran does understand Turkey's concerns, security concerns about border incursions and the threat from the Kurds. And Iran is encouraging Turkey to resort to diplomacy instead of military operations to achieve its goals. And that can happen much easier if Turkey listens to this logic. But at the same time, I would like to add that the summit in Tehran is sending a very clear message to the United States. Iran, Turkey, and Russia wish to work together no matter what the US does or what America's policies are. Russia, Turkey, and Iran are important international players. By hosting this summit, Iran wants to show that it has the strategic options to defeat the US sanctions, even if the JCPOA is going to die. It's possible that the nuclear deal will die in the near future. So Iran is positioning itself against the West by strengthening relations with Russia and China.
Mustafa Gurbuz, I'm going to look at some of the other decisions that were taken at this conference. Of course, President Erdogan held bilateral meetings with Iran as well as the Russian President Putin. But let's talk about the Turkey-Iran talks. I mean, one of the things they talked about was increasing trade between the two countries up to $30 billion. That's pretty ambitious. Are they going to get there?
Well, I think when you try to put certain economic issues as a point to make the relations warmer, you shouldn't be missing the big picture in the past 2 years, I can say. Again, Turkey's warming relations with Israel and the Gulf allies of Israel is very much concerning for Iran. And that is also happening in terms of Syria. When we discuss about the Syria and the operations in Syria, we shouldn't be missing the link between Iraq and Syria. So Sinjar region, for example, in the past year, 7 rocket attacks coming from pro-Iranian groups, and they repeat their warnings about the consequences of Turkish military base in Iraq. And Turkey's militarism in Iraq has been intensified in the past few years. Iran is very much worried about this antagonism and maybe new antagonism that may be coming because Israel's warming relations with Turkey could have a price tag, which could threaten the Iranian national security. So in that sense, I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on the economic side of these promises. Rather, there is a major concern as Biden is just consolidating this alliance against Iran. Turkey's standpoint will be a very, very major question for everyone. And again, we see a balancing act as we see the balancing act of Turkey in the Ukraine war with U.S. and Russia. A very similar balancing act is happening in this picture as well.
Anton, Fedyashin, one of the biggest developments that didn't come directly out of the summit, but it did come around the same time, is the announcement of that energy deal between Iran and Russia. The Russian energy giant Gazprom is involved in it, and so is the Iranian National Oil Company. It's potentially worth $40 billion. Under the terms of that deal, Russia will help Iran develop its oil fields, its gas fields, also its liquefied natural gas industry. How significant is this?
Well, it's a turning point in the geoeconomics of the region. Look, the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, opening the door for the Iranians to continue working on their nuclear program, but at the same time, essentially opening the doors for other countries to make their own decisions about how they want to approach Iran, which again, as Akbar said earlier, is a major player in the region. The Russians, meanwhile, of course, are under unprecedented sanctions from the West, including those on energy, which are wreaking absolute and unprecedented havoc on the European markets. And the Russians can now easily turn towards the Iranians and start dealing with them in terms of energy issues. And there's absolutely nothing really that the West can do about it now. It can't sanction anymore. The sanctions gun is pretty much empty. Moreover, the Russians can do with the Iranians what they're doing with the Indians and the Chinese and the Saudis. They can offer them very good terms in terms of purchasing Russian energy in exchange for working with Iran, helping it develop its energy, while also, by the way, benefiting from Iranian expertise in gas turbine especially, technology. And so I think we're seeing the beginning of the Russian turn, the Russian pivot towards Asia, which is something that Kissinger had been warning for almost a decade now is not in the West's interest. But Western policy towards Russia, especially because of the Ukraine crisis, has produced the exact opposite effect of what Kissinger had hoped for. It's driving the Russians closer and closer to all of their Asian, South and Far East Asian neighbors. And what we're hearing coming out of Tehran today is just part of a much larger trend.
Ali Akbar, Dareini, talking about that deal, the energy deal between Iran and Russia, what does it look like in Tehran? I mean, how much leverage does this give Tehran? How much power does it give Tehran at a time when it could be facing more sanctions from the United States, if indeed, as that JCPOA nuclear agreement collapses?
It's a big deal. Although it is a memorandum of understanding and it is not a binding contract, but it sends a clear message to everybody that Iran and Russia are getting closer, and since both of them are the target of severe economic sanctions, they are forging closer ties. This closer relationship between Iran and Russia is not a choice, but it is a strategic necessity for both Iran and Russia in order to be able to defeat the sanctions. So this is a big deal and a turning point in their relations, and this is a signal that Tehran and Moscow are solidifying their relationship into a full-fledged partnership. Under a cost and benefit analysis, Iran and Russia see that for the sake of their own national interests, they have to work closer together in order to be able to defeat the sanctions and take one more step towards a multipolar system.
Okay, Mustafa Gurbuz, very briefly, I've just got a bit of time left, but President Erdogan also held talks with President Putin on Ukraine. They talked particularly about the export of Ukrainian grain through Turkey, or Turkey facilitating the export of that grain. What do we know about that?
Well, this is, yes, the top agenda item for the Ukraine and the Putin's leverage point in terms of the drones, Turkey's leverage point in this game. But perhaps, again, we need to look at these exchanges together with the Syrian scene. So can we see a development on this particular issue? Well, if Turkey could think about its drone strategy and not escalate certain things in Ukraine, and you know, again, it depends on the exchanges in this bilateral talks. But for sure, Turkey put this as a very strategic choice, because Turkey's how to say, the importance for NATO alliance to have that relationship peacemaker strategy. So if anything comes out, Turkey would sell it to the Western world as it's very much useful for the NATO, because it can break the ice and have some progress.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is all the time we have. That's been The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.